Ahoy! New World will see some pretty big balance changes in January to equip loads as well as to specific weapons, and many of these changes are changes that we have been asking for a long time, that really have been in demand, so I'm very excited to see them coming into the game, though I'm obviously not happy about every single one and how they're gonna execute that. We also have some insight from Dave into the overall state of balance at the moment for different game modes. Overall, he says balance is progressing nicely. He says that the balance before Season 3 was the best they had, but then they somewhat intentionally broke it through the big changes with artifacts and so on, so it made sense that for a while it would be a bit more wobbly. He says they're not anywhere near done with the changes to balance that out, but it's getting better. Overall, he thinks a lot of the problems are more systemic rather than about weapon balance. For example, pre-mates and OPR, a general lack of matchmaking, the role distribution issues when one team can have way more healers than another, and they have, I quote, exciting news about that in May. On my last video, quite a few people speculated that what they mentioned briefly in their last talk was about them wanting to introduce role queue for other modes, and that's what they're going to combine with arena crossplay. I really hope that that is not the case and we don't have to wait until May to even get an announcement on when we'll get crossplay arenas. Especially in smaller regions, that would definitely not be good for the queues. And speaking of arenas, they've said that currently arenas have really good build diversity still. The blunderbuss is still looking very strong, so they'll take another look at that. Likewise, the life staff is still strong, and so is the combination of fire staff and ice gauntlet. Sword and Shield has crept up in the ranks here and is also becoming a more valuable option overall. In Outpost Rush, the situation is a little bit different. There is a big gap between what wins matches, which are primarily bruisers and Sword and Shield players, versus what gets the most damage and kills, which are primarily ranged players. As I said before, that also has a lot to do with the solo experience just being much better as a ranged player, and overall that leads to them still having more ranged players, which can feel oppressive at times. In PvE, on the other hand, we are somewhat seeing the opposite. Overall, Dave feels good about PvE, but melee still dominates, especially with cleaves, and it's also easier to heal and buff them because they're already in a clump together. We're seeing more fire staff and even ice gauntlet, which is not entirely surprising if you've been following the higher level metas, but the diversity is much better in lower levels of mutations compared to higher levels. We traditionally see more of those melee setups. The Greatsword is still the most used main hand, and we're seeing more diversity in offhand builds. So based on that, we're going to see quite a few changes. Beginning with artifacts, we're going to see a nerf to Pestilence. Likely that the outgoing healing reduction is reduced by half to be more in line with plagued effects in general. That obviously takes away a little bit from the unique identity of Pestilence, but on the other hand, it kind of just brings Pestilence back to the place where it was before the plague change overall was introduced. Between its passive and plague crits, it was double dipping on the healing reduction, or the outgoing healing reduction rather, for a total of 28%, whereas previously it was 15%. So even after this nerf, it would still be 20.5%, which I think is still strong. So overall, I don't think this is going to massively nerf Pestilence. It just means that stacking anti-heal with Pestilence is going to be a little bit less effective. So I expect Pestilence to remain a strong artifact. Koya's knee guards is going to get a buff. They've said it's just not strong enough. They want it to be the best option if you're gearing against range specifically, versus featherweight being more of a generic counter to everything, but they want it to be stronger than featherweight when it comes to countering ranged. And they're also considering to maybe introduce an artifact for melee damage in the future that basically does the opposite. Koya's knee guards have gone through an insane amount of iterations at this point. The passive was different on PTR, and that was different on the patch notes from how it is in the actual in-game client. So we'll just have to wait and see where it actually ends up, but I'm expecting them to maybe bring it up to the value of the patch notes, which was 20% of reduction. If you are enjoying the video so far, consider subscribing and clicking the bell, and if you want to support me further and get early trading tips, I'm going to post another one today, then consider supporting me on Patreon. As Dave put it at the beginning of the show, the bow and musket are getting buffs. Well, that's not quite the full story. They're getting buffs for PvE. In return, their damage in PvP is going to be reduced so that overall the damage in PvP will stay the same as it is right now. In addition to that, Empowering Explosive Arrow had a bug that allowed you to have a permanent empower from it that wouldn't drop off after one shot, and that is going to be fixed, so that should bring bow in line a little bit more in those cases where that was being abused. On the fire staff, the flamethrower is slightly oppressive at the moment. One example that David pointed out here is that heavy fire staff builds are kind of taking off as well, and therefore they are reducing the speed while in flamethrower, so I guess it's going to be easier to just walk away from it. Additionally, there will be a minor nerf to Empowering Fireball, one of the most used perks on the fire staff. Now that is going to hurt a few people, I think, because a lot of people are running Empowering Fireball as the perk on their weapon, and the question is if that's still going to be the best perk to run after that. My prayers for the Void Gauntlet have been heard, at least somewhat. The damage of the light and heavy attacks for Void Blade specifically will be increased. After those nerfs ages ago, I think this is absolutely appropriate. I'm very happy about this change. I just hope that they fix the tracking issues and the grid issues along with that, because as of now, the Void Blade is still probably the most common weapon to ghost on light attacks in the first place. So as long as that exists, it's kind of hard to balance the weapon, because you might suddenly lose all your damage and swing into nothing. And that brings us to the biggest change of the patch. Dave had quite a few remarks about equip load balance. When it comes to light equip, he thinks that that's in a very good place for ranged. It's not too strong or too weak, but light melee has some weakness, and they want to improve that without buffing the ranged players. So what they need to do for that is introduce a little tech, and therefore that is probably something that we'll see in Season 5, whereas many of the other changes here will come before that. Medium is in a weird place since losing its low stamina dodge, therefore a lot of the meta is dominated by heavy now. There's generally been a lot more usage of heavy equip load, especially since people got access to Void Darkplate. This isn't really a surprise to anyone who has actually looked at the changes over time closer. For example, with the dodge changes that came to medium and heavy, not the ones about the stamina, but rather about the animation of them, the distance of heavy dodges to the side actually became longer than that of medium dodges. So the dodges between medium and heavy feel very, very similar at this point. Along with that, heavy gets various other benefits that medium doesn't get, and the damage loss isn't that significant, so there is not much reason to go medium compared to heavy. On the other hand, there is still value in going light. You get the highest potential damage in the game, and you get the highest mobility, so of course that is an option that players will keep considering. But the middle ground just doesn't offer much anymore. Their solution is what I am least happy with in this patch, because they're considering an increase of the dodge cost in heavy to 55, because they want to avoid too much dodge spam by changing it back in medium. In my opinion, this is entirely the wrong approach, and I say this as someone who is running heavy and who likes running heavy, but who's also ran every single equip load, so I have a good feel for what the difference between them is. And I don't believe that the game will be more balanced by making heavy significantly worse, because this would cut down your total amount of possible dodges from 3 to 2. In my opinion, this would definitely result in heavy being played significantly less to a very drastic extent, but I believe it would just result in a meta being heavily shifted back to light equip load, because there still isn't any redeeming quality in medium at the moment, and there wouldn't be if they don't do any other changes to that, and purely nerfing heavy won't fix that. I think the massive dodge spam in medium is way less of a concern than it used to be with the removal of the Dex perk, which was a major factor in that. And they could also, again, do a middle ground here. They could, for example, say we reduce the cost down to 45 stamina, just something to take away a little bit of the stamina, but cost give a little bit of a benefit to medium. More importantly, I believe they should adjust the dodge ranges and maybe the speed or whatever for medium specifically, so that the dodge in medium feels significantly better than in heavy, while not feeling as good as the one in light. Heavy is oppressive at the moment, but that's because there's just no incentive to go medium. All of the medium players at the beginning of the expansion just gradually switched over to heavy. And if heavy remained oppressive after buffs to medium, you could also target other things, like for example the inherent crowd control reduction or things like that, that aren't necessarily defining heavy but make it stronger than medium in places where it maybe doesn't have to be. I think targeting the stamina first is the opposite of the slow and careful approach that they want to do now. It's going for the jugular right away. Definitely not an approach that I personally like here, and I think also further risk of alienating current players here that just geared up for heavy and enjoy the playstyle. There will apparently be more changes to equip load in Season 5, so we'll see what that brings on top of that. The same is true in general, so some of the changes will come in early January, minor patch, and big ones come in Season 5. I will of course update you here, so consider subscribing and clicking the bell if you want to get notified. And again, in the next days we'll also talk about artifact armor and skull and bones. that I had the chance to play. So if you're interested in that, same thing applies. If you'd like to support me further, you can do so on Patreon. Thanks to all of my patrons who already do exactly that. And thank you for watching. Duke Sloth, out.